welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Monica, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. It's been a little while. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, it's great to be back, Robbie. So my name's Monika Wiesak, and I wrote America's Last President: What the World Lost When It Lost John F. Kennedy. And it's really a policy book. It focuses on all the policies he was pursuing during his administration, and particularly those that changed with the transition to Johnson, because I think there's this misperception there that there was great continuity. And so I really wanted to show that there actually was not that much continuity at all. There was in some of the basics like civil rights, Medicare, but there's so much outside of that that changed quite drastically, with JFK's assassination.
With JFK, his policies on civil rights and other things that he was going to be establishing, things that he made promises to, that LBJ ended up picking up and then using it for his own kind of legacy during his presidency. What are your thoughts on that? Because there are some conversations a few days after the assassination with LBJ. I think it's the 24th, the 25th, and then someone like the 27th. He speaks to Martin Luther King. He speaks to a bunch of people, but he always keeps saying, in Kennedy's memory, in Kennedy's memory, in Kennedy's, like it's a way to get someone to say yes, because it would be a jerk if they said no. And it was kind of disgusting to listen to. But like I can't tell if he's being authentic, like I want to do this for Kennedy, or if he's just using it because he knows that they'll do it. Like he calls Larry O'Brien and tells him, you were such a good man for Kennedy. I want you on my team. It would be a dishonor to his memory if we let his whole legacy fall apart. I'm like, what exactly are you talking about in specific? Like he's just broad brushing the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the civil rights bill would have passed either way, but there's no doubt that his assassination probably guilted some people into voting for it, so to speak. So I think that is a factor, that people felt more obligated to approve it after he was assassinated because it was his bill. He did introduce it, he did push it. And Lyndon Johnson didn't actually do much to push it at all. Initially, he encouraged JFK not to put the bill out there because he felt it would hurt JFK's reelection chances and it would hurt his approval rating, which it did hurt his approval rating, and it probably would have had some degree of impact on his reelection because people have to remember he won a lot of the southern states in 1960. And so he was going to end up losing some of those states in 1964 because of the introduction of a civil rights bill. So Johnson definitely encouraged him not to introduce it. Now, once it was introduced, I know Bobby in his oral history said that LBJ was basically going to leave it to Bobby because LBJ didn't want to take the blame. So he's like, Bobby, you run with this, you try to get it passed. That way, I don't think LBJ said this explicitly to Bobby, but it was Bobby's interpretation in the sense that if it fails, it's Bobby's fault. If it succeeds, LBJ gets the credit. That's kind of how Bobby put it. So I don't think LBJ did too much with regard to that civil rights bill, even though he gets a lot of credit for it these days.
There is a phone call I could play later on, but it is LBJ and Eisenhower talking, and this is after Kennedy's assassination, and he's speaking about what RFK is doing in other Latin American countries, like going there and talking about them about certain political stuff. And LBJ was just not happy with it at all. Like he's being a pain in the ass doing this type of whatever work that he was doing at the time. I think it was about letting them know about certain types of like government involvement in their country or something like that. And there's photos of it as well too. But I always wondered what was the relationship between RFK and LBJ because there are phone calls with them in the same room talking to somebody else. And it's so hard now because it's a question that's kind of going to cover the episode here, but it's about JFK and RFK's associations and people that were friends of theirs because I've heard so much back and forth about people that did this for JFK or did this for JFK, and then I see them and hear them on phone calls like completely tossing JFK out the window and just going in with LBJ because he's the new president, which makes me like conflicted a little bit.
Yeah, so Bobby and LBJ hated each other. I don't think that's any secret that there was, no love there whatsoever. So JFK didn't actually want LBJ as his vice president. So what happened is he sort of LBJ was Senate Majority Leader, and LBJ was very kind of vindictive, bitter type of person. And JFK was worried if I don't, because JFK was running against LBJ for the Democratic nomination, and he was worried if I don't smooth things over with Johnson, he's going to be a total, Payne as Senate Majority Leader, and I'm not going to be able to get any legislation through because he's literally going to block everything. And so he felt I need to smooth things over with him. Some people encouraged him to offer the vice presidency to him. From a political standpoint, it was kind of good as well because LBJ was from Texas and he did help JFK win Texas. And so politically, it was kind of a shrewd move as well. But he didn't actually want LBJ as his VP. And according to JFK himself, he didn't actually offer it to him. He just kind of held it out, but he didn't really offer it to try to smooth things over. And he never in a million years thought LBJ would say yes. But according to JFK, LBJ kind of grabbed at it, like without JFK even really offering it, he grabbed at it. And the other thing to remember is JFK and Bobby hadn't slept in like 3 days because this is at the convention. Back then, you had to choose a VP during the convention. So they hadn't slept in 3 days. They weren't thinking very clearly. They weren't really of the right mind. And so JFK went back upstairs to Bobby and he's like, holy crap. He said, yes, what do I do now? And Bobby's like, let me go downstairs and try to take care of it. So Bobby went downstairs and tried to talk LBJ out of it, told him, oh, it's such a bad idea if you're vice president. I don't really think it's your thing. And LBJ from that moment on just became incredibly bitter towards Bobby. And that bitterness just grew and grew and grew. So by the time LBJ was president, when Bobby went to Europe, when Bobby went to Latin America, it seemed like certain entities or the press or whoever were giving a lot of attention to Bobby and were like taking seriously things he said about foreign policy. And LBJ really, really did not like that because he felt like he was being undermined and his authority was being undermined because here's, this kid brother that he hates, like running around, running his mouth or whatnot. So there was definitely a lot of bad blood there between Bobby and LBJ. I think JFK did not care for LBJ, but Bobby was more of an emotional person than JFK. I think JFK had a really high emotional intelligence. I think he was always really calm and able to work with whoever. And so JFK was able to work with LBJ. He didn't necessarily like him. I know Jackie said in her oral history that JFK often said, my God, can you imagine if LBJ ever becomes president? So he viewed LBJ as being really incompetent. Like he felt like he kept trying to give LBJ stuff to do, but LBJ wasn't getting it done. And I think JFK attributed it to like a combination of laziness and incompetence. Not necessarily something nefarious, but he definitely didn't think very highly of LBJ, but he didn't have that same negative emotional reaction to him that I think Bobby did.
Did he think like Bobby was going to be gunning for the position of vice president or just more powers than what he was for attorney general?
Yeah, I think it just bothered LBJ how much power Bobby had because Bobby was really the number two man in Washington when JFK was president. Even though he wasn't VP, even though he was just attorney general, everyone knew he was the president's brother. Everyone knew the president confided in him, that the president trusted him. And so he was, in a lot of ways, the number two man in Washington. And I think, LBJ did feel a certain jealousy towards that because he is a very vindictive, kind of jealous, bitter type of person.
I think you see it in a lot of the photos when Kennedy's signing something. The vice president should be right behind the president when that situation's going on. In a lot of photos, LBJ's way in the back, like behind a bunch of people. Because I feel like for him, just because of his ego and stuff like that, it kind of seems like he knew he was going to be president, or when he becomes president, whether he's going to run on his own and just leave JFK if the assassination didn't happen, if this was like in the 60s before, 63. I feel like he didn't want to be in a photo where he was in the back or right beside someone signing a bill. He wanted to be the person that was signing the bill and people standing around him. So that makes sense why he would stand like in the back. What was interesting to me is like trying to find out who could have they have trusted. This appeared in the HSCA when they were talking with Nicholas Katzenbach. And I know he gets mentioned in the conspiracy world a lot as like he's a conspirator. I have a different opinion. I think he was definitely playing cover up for sure. But I think when I heard him speak about RFK, I don't know if you've ever heard it. I can play that too. It's like very sincere. Like I think he was the one that was like working for Bobby, not necessarily working for JFK. And he gave the most honest depiction of RFK. He also gave a great depiction of the relationship between JFK and RFK and how it pissed off J. Edgar Hoover. And he gives a whole background on just Hoover didn't like someone that was closer to the president, and that was Bobby. And it was like, yeah, like, but who could the Kennedys have trusted besides each other? Because I can't really look at anybody that was like there 100%. I don't know if you have anybody that you might have come across.
Yeah, I think at that level of power, it's hard to trust anybody, no matter who you are. Unless you're brothers, unless you have that bond from childhood. I think JFK trusted Ted Sorensen. He was his speechwriter and one of his aides. They'd worked together since the early 1950s. I think he trusted people like Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers and those kind of Irish guys that had been with him for many years since his earliest campaigns. And I think Kenny and Bobby went to college together, went to Harvard together, so they knew each other even before he knew JFK. But those guys weren't really in his administration. They were just like pals of his. I mean, Kenny was his appointment secretary, so he was in the administration, but he didn't have like an official position or whatnot. He wasn't working on policy per se. But in terms of policy, yeah, I don't think you can really trust anyone at that level, except for maybe the people that have been with you for 10 or 15 years, like people like Ted Sorensen and, obviously his brother. And, I think he had decent relationships with people like McNamara and Dean Rusk. He was disappointed in Rusk. He didn't really like him as Secretary of State, but just in terms of, I don't think he felt like Rusk was backstabbing him or anything like that. Um,
Because there's a couple phone calls I found with Rusk, and he was talking to people like Mike Mansfield and others, and he was sitting there with LBJ, and he was letting them know like we got to make sure we come with all the facts, and there can't be any rumors or conspiracies or any types of murmurs, like just on the Warren Commission conclusions. And I was like, man, I thought you were on the team of wanting like an open investigation. I mean, I know we never heard from Bobby, and LBJ used that to his advantage when I think it was before Hoover actually talked to LBJ about a commission. There was Joe Alsop, I think his name was, so independent Washington. He talked about that there needed to be a commission put together, and this was like on the 22nd, like a couple hours after everything happened. So it was just weird to see that there was like this conversation about a committee going on, and then LBJ was refusing it. Like, I'm not doing that. We're going with the FBI thing. And then hearing that he started using things like, we don't want Bobby to have to take up the mantle to investigate his own brother's assassination. So we would like it if you would take the, and it was just like, wow, okay. Wow, thought you guys didn't care at all.
Yeah, I mean, definitely everyone tried to sweep it under the rug, which is really sad and disappointing. I don't think there was anyone in the government that made any serious effort to investigate it. And that is, it does make you like, I understand because no one's like sort of in charge, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like LBJ's technically commander in chief. If he says we're not going to investigate this thing, like people aren't really going to go against him because if they are, they're going to get fired. But nobody really tried to speak up and say, no, I think we really need to investigate this. I think there's more to this. I think a lot of people felt there was more to it, but nobody was going to be the one to stand up and push for it because I don't think they had the power to. I don't think they would have been around if they did.
Do you think it was weird that Johnson kept some members of the Kennedy administration to use for his own?
No, not at all, because I think he wanted to show that there was a smooth transition. He didn't want people to blame him for the assassination. So if he had switched people out, everybody would have been like, well, Johnson did this, right? So he wanted to show that there was continuity. He wanted to show that there was a smooth transition. And that's why he wanted people like Kenny and Sorensen and all these people to stay around at least for a few months or a year, before he switched them out. And they ultimately quit. I think they stayed around for a little while and then they sort of quit and left. But LBJ very much wanted them to stay. And I think they sort of felt obligated to the country to stay for a period of time. And I'm sure they wanted to stay in the levers of power and find out what's going on. So even if they had no trust of LBJ, they knew if they didn't stay, they'd have no access to any information whatsoever. But at least if they stayed, they'd be able to at least hear a bit of what's going on and, whether there's really an investigation happening. And so I think they probably had a lot of motives for staying for a period of time before they left. And then, of course, other people who weren't close, stayed for much longer periods of time.
I think the name's Grant Stockdale. I know it's not Lansdale. I always get those names confused, but he was someone that knew Kennedy from like the college years. and I know he was very distraught after Kennedy's assassination. And there's like rumors because he fell out of a tall building and died, and everyone called it a suicide attempt because he was so distraught over it. But there's been rumors that it hasn't been that. His lawyer said that he was talking about there was a plot or something. But that whole thing, like, I haven't seen a whole lot of people besides that scenario where they've been like completely just shattered, where they gave up everything after JFK died, which was weird for me. Like, nobody was calling Bobby and telling Bobby, like, hey, I'm sorry that this happened to you. It was like, just ignore Bobby, walk past him, don't look at him in the hallway type deal. And I was like, does anybody understand the ramifications or just understand what happened in November? Like, at the end right there, like, that's pretty bad.
Yeah, I think people were also in a state of shock. I think people didn't know how to react. I think, a lot of it, I think it's two things. Like I said, I think some of it was people who were loyal to JFK and wanted to stick around and find out what's going on and at least have some degree of influence to carry on JFK's vision and his policies. And the other part was just these people weren't close. They were just coworkers, you know what I mean? And they weren't going to quit their job just because they had a new boss. Most people, if their boss leaves, they stay at their job. They don't quit. And so a lot of it was just that people were just staying at their jobs, and their jobs wasn't to investigate the assassination. Like if your boss dies or dies in a strange way, it's not your job to investigate why he died. It's the police's job. And you can still continue your job. You can feel sad for your boss, but you're not going to quit and raise hell about it or whatnot. You're just going to go on with your day. And so I think a lot of it was that.
The reason I bring this up is because it seems like if you don't have anyone around you that you can trust, you don't get the right information. And I do believe, I think there is a historical record that Kennedy was pressured into events, much like the Bay of Pigs type situation, giving wrong information to him on the act that he has to act upon this to see whether they want this thing, inevitable outcome to occur. But that's not good. LBJ didn't have that. I mean, he was pressuring everybody and he was trying to be, it seems like very friendly on the phone, but he was definitely doing some Johnson treatment type activities when it came to meeting them in person. I think he knew how to work the political game a little bit more. But like people like Evelyn Lincoln, that Kennedy obviously had a close association with. And then mistakenly for a lot of people, they think John Connally was a friend of JFK. I mean, I think they were cordial, but I think there's a lot more evidence to show that that was Johnson's boy right there.
Oh yeah, Connolly I think was much closer to Johnson than to JFK. Like there was JFK was cordial with everyone. He even, and Jackie in her oral history said, why are you so nice to these people that are so mean to you? And JFK said, they're colleagues. I have to work with them. If I don't work with them, I'll never get any legislation through. I'll never get anything passed. I'll never get anything accomplished. So he was just cordial with everyone because he felt that's what he needed to do to get stuff done. But he knew full well that people could be, deceptive and have their own agendas and whatnot. So he wasn't naive in that sense. And he definitely was lied to a lot. Like you said, he was lied about the Bay of Pigs. He was lied about how things were going in Vietnam. They weren't really honest with him about that, the military. So definitely people lied to him to try to push their own agendas. But I think that's true like in any job that you work in, there's people who have agendas, who want with one department or another, or, wants this or wants that. So they're going to kind of maybe not even lie, but like omit information or whatnot to get the policies they want. And so I don't think that's that uncommon in the working environment necessarily for people to kind of push their own agendas.
What would you
So
consider?
the military, oh, go
Uh,
ahead.
I was going to ask, what would you consider JFK's best asset from your research and your work on him? I think the television stuff was really, really good. It seemed like he was good at doing good talks, and that was very comforting for a lot of people. And I think he did like more television stuff than really any president has. But LBJ from phone calls, like I said, I'm hearing him talking to Washington Post editors and people that are obviously some type of close association with them. He's like, I don't want this to blow up in my face. So make sure, that I want to make sure we're on good ground. So you're going to report this properly. And it was like, I don't see, I mean, I've heard a thing with Bill Moyers and JFK, but I have not seen as much as like LBJ has private 5 minute phone calls with every single major news establishment thing back then, like making sure this is going to be reported on as very good for me. And I'm just like, Yeah, that's a major advantage if you're president.
Yeah, I think JFK's best quality is that he cared. He cared about doing a good job. He he wanted to serve the public. Like he was president for the right reasons. He wasn't there for his own ego. He wasn't there to serve himself. He was there to serve the public, both the American public and it obviously, but also the global public. And I think all his policies show that and that he was working with that end goal. So he was obviously a savvy politician, but he was a savvy politician, in the service of grand ideas, in the service of, a vision that he was trying to pursue, not necessarily merely in the service of his own reelection or his own ego. So I think his best quality was just that he cared. And I think he had a very, very high emotional intelligence. He was a very rational person. So he's very idealistic. He was very rational. He called himself an idealist without illusions. And so he was able to react calmly to things, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was very, very calm during that crisis. Everyone was like reacting on emotion and saying, we need to bomb Cuba, we need to do this, we need to do that. And JFK's like, no, wait a minute, let's think this through, what are our options? And so he was just very calm, very rational, very emotionally stable, I think. And that goes back to him being able to work with people that were very rude to him, is he's like, there's a goal we're trying to meet. We're trying to get policies passed. This isn't about my ego or my feelings or, it's about trying to get stuff done. And that's why he was able to work so cordially, with everyone. And so I think just his emotional intelligence, the fact that he cared, I think, and that he was also extremely hardworking. Like he gave a lot of thought to everything he was doing. If you listen to him at meetings, he's constantly asking questions. He's listening to people. He's not necessarily just trying to talk and get his view across. He's trying to listen to everyone else's views and formulate his own view based on what everyone else says, based on, trying to gather all the information and all the different viewpoints. So he was a great listener. Everyone said he was a great listener, which is, I think, another quality that made him a very good president. So I think he had a lot of great qualities.
Between LBJ and JFK, who did the most trips to foreign countries to establish good relations?
I don't know because I'm not that familiar with LBJ's travel schedule. JFK didn't travel too much. He invited a lot of people to the States. I mean, he did do several trips to Latin America. He did several trips to Europe, but he didn't travel too much. But I know, for like example, for Africa, he had on average one African head of state visit the White House every month. I think with Eisenhower, it was one a year. And I think with LBJ, it was probably closer to Eisenhower, like one a year. So he invited a lot of people to visit the White House, that other presidents did not, more so than traveling himself. Like he didn't actually himself go to Africa. Bobby did later. But so he didn't make too many trips abroad, but he did do a few.
Now, I asked that question because there's obviously photos you can look up of like Martin Luther King speaking with um, LBJ. I think those are more popularized, maybe because the LBJ library just kind of is a little bit more massive. But with the JFK stuff, I was always wondering because JFK has that personal, like warming, kind of communicative way of talking and being very engaging with people. And LBJ is a little bit different, but it seems like LBJ never left the White House when people were coming to see him. He did do some trips, but most of the times it was just to other places in the States. Like, if I was going to ask you if you could examine when the civil rights thing really kicked off, when there were more school protests, when there was more sit-ins, when there was other things going on that were obviously problems that needed to be fixed or established, who would you say was more involved? I know this is kind of like a partial question only because of the fact that I know later in the 60s is when we really see it uptick more, where there's more sit-ins and all this type of stuff. But who was actually more responsive to the situation? Because I've heard a couple phone calls with LBJ in Mississippi and a scenario that's going on down there, but it wasn't about resolving the issue. It was more about finding out what's going on and how do we, not turn this into a giant newspaper headline.
Oh, definitely Bobby and JFK, particularly Bobby because he was Attorney General. So Bobby was really dealing with civil rights for JFK. But when there were the major crises, like the crisis in Mississippi, um, when they tried to get that student enrolled into the college, JFK was on the phone all night. I think he was on the phone till like 5 a.m. or something. I think Jackie was out of town and he called her at like 5 a.m. when they were done. And they finally had Meredith registered and said, we finally got him registered. So he was up like all night, trying to deal with this one student trying to get registered into a Mississippi college. And so he was, very involved in terms of responding to stuff. But it was when it got to like critical point, like the Mississippi thing, the first stage was really dealing with Bobby. So Bobby was like the first point of contact. And then when he needed JFK, he would go to the JFK. But JFK was very responsive to the civil rights issue.
What would you say his biggest legacy is, JFK?
Um, it's hard to say because they've trashed his character so much, I feel like the press over the years. And so there's really two legacies. There's this like legacy that's been created by the corporate press. But I think in terms of people who have actually studied his presidency, I think, he's viewed as a peacemaker. He's viewed as someone who wanted to make the world a better place. He's viewed as someone who wanted to uplift, nations out of poverty and people out of poverty, and wanted to give people opportunity, wanted to give people hope, just basically wanted to make the world a better, more just, more peaceful place. I think people who have studied his presidency, that's how they view him as.
I'm gonna share a clip. Just it's John McCone. There's a couple things. There's like a few clips with John McCone I'm going to share, but then also I have a phone call of RFK and JFK talking about John McCone that I found, and I was like, no way. I was like, because I think it always gets mentioned based on RFK Jr.'s story about his dad meeting with John McCone and then talking to him, and did the CIA do this after the assassination happened? A lot of people, I guess, would assume that that must be at least someone close to JFK if he's going to have information or something of that sort. Like I said, this interview was recorded by two unnamed people. Wish I can give them credit for it, but I think it's just pretty telling or interesting.
What was Jack Kennedy really like?
Johnny, you respond to that, dear.
Well, I found Jack Kennedy to be a very personable, engaging man. He wasn't in office long enough to really put a lasting imprint on history. Although I do think the fact that he initiated and insisted on the Apollo project, which carried the man put a man on the moon and got him back, and opened up outer space as an area of exploration for our human resources, was really a great contribution.
Little did he know, 63 years later, however long later, we're still talking about JFK today. That's why it's always funny to me when I see like a comment about someone saying, "Why does any of this matter anymore?" So it was in the past. I was like, "Was he obviously had a lasting impact?" Now, the Apollo thing that he mentioned, I don't think that's the only thing I think about when I think of Kennedy. I think a lot of people think of like the Vietnam War. I mean, maybe the Apollo thing was just the most successful because it was the only one that was like fully like saw to the end of like just going up in space and accomplishing the mission. But he states later in some of these interviews, well, this is another one about the Apollo project.
That he initiated and insisted on the Apollo project, which carried the man put a man on the moon and got him back, and opened up outer space as an area of exploration for our human resources, was really a great contribution.
He really gave it the impetus to get it going.
Oh yes, he did it. He pressed it through the various departments of government, through the Congress, and it was his project.
What do you think he would have thought about Star Wars? Do you think he would have gone along with this? What Reagan is involved in now?
I don't know whether he'd gone along with Star Wars or not.
And then,
Although I do think.
What about Vietnam? You got to
Vietnam War.
Really? Do you think he would have gone ahead the way Johnson did and then finally maybe pulled out, or what do you think he would?
No, he didn't get us in as Johnson did. He got us in further than Eisenhower, but the buildup took place after Kennedy left us and Johnson took over. Kennedy told me, and it's recorded in one or two books, Kennedy's position was that once the 64 elections were out of the way, and he was assassinated in November of 63, and the election was coming on the next year. Once they were out of the way, he would pare back our presence in Vietnam to the level established by Eisenhower and established at the Geneva Conference. And that was about 800 of the military assistance group.
What
Is
about
that
Vietnam?
accurate? Is the main question. What John McCone just said there.
I think so. I don't know privately what conversations JFK and McCone had, but I think it's accurate that JFK, after the election, was planning to scale back the advisors. And he'd even put the first order for withdrawal of advisors in October 63 before the election. So I definitely think that that's accurate. And kind of going back into like why people put a lot of attention on the going to the moon thing, I think it's because the press focuses on policies where there was continuity. So we did go to the moon, we did pass the civil rights bill, we did pass Medicare. And so they tend to focus on those things that didn't change. What they tend not to focus on is those policies where there was a clear change between Kennedy and Johnson. And so I think people are just more aware of those policies that had continuity, such as going to the moon, because those are the kind of policies the press focuses on.
Well, Vietnam's one of the biggest things for most JFK fans or JFK researchers or just people that just look at that whole time period in general. And a lot of people believe that JFK would have pulled out of Vietnam entirely. This sounds a little bit more accurate to me. I think because you can look through JFK's administration and see actual change in someone. I think you've talked about the Khrushchev letters and things where he was actually trying to establish like a peace in all time when it was really just trying to do something that nobody's ever really tried to do before. And again, what would you say when it came to something like the change of JFK? I mean, if you were going to say from your perspective that JFK, not using John McCone's words, but would just deal with the whole Vietnam situation, do you think he would have eventually just made sure all troops were out and we wouldn't have any involvement in there?
I think he was going to, it's hard to say for sure. I think he was going to definitely reduce the involvement in Vietnam significantly. Whether he would have left it at the Eisenhower days or whether he would have pulled out every last person, I don't think we know the answer to that question. I don't think JFK knew the answer to that question. In terms of him changing, I actually don't think he really changed in office because I read all his speeches as a congressman, as a senator, as a president. I think he always had the views he had. I think in terms of Vietnam, a lot of it was political pressure. When he sent the advisors to Vietnam, he said, I've already had Laos, I've already had the Bay of Pigs. I can't I think politically defend another loss to the communists in the same year. So he was also, he had a grand vision, but he was also really aware of the political realities. And he knew he needed to do, there was just, he wasn't king of the world. He couldn't just do whatever he wanted. And so, he did compromise on things. He did, do things that he felt he needed to do politically. So I don't think he ever changed. I always think his vision was his vision.
Do you
I
think that
think
he
he
was
got
putting
better at
on
implementing.
Do you think he's putting on a bit of a disguise then? Because if we talk about the facts, like when his original like campaign when he was running was a lot different than his speeches that he gave as president. I think that's what I meant by
I don't
change is
think
that
so.
well, they were
I
pressing a
I
lot
think
more on the
people
Cold Warrior aspect of things.
um yes and no, but I think people weren't listening to the nuance in his speeches. So he was uh going against the Soviet Union, but he was also attacking European colonialism at the same time. So for me, JFK was an anti-colonialist, and that he gave a lot of speeches as a senator, not just the Algeria speech. There were lots of speeches. For some reason, the Algeria one's the one that gets all the attention, but he gave lots of speeches where he compared European colonialism to Soviet colonialism. And he said, we don't want either one. And so he was really an anti-colonialist. So it is true that he attacked the Soviet Union a lot, but he also attacked Europe a lot. And I think so people view him as this typical Cold Warrior, but most of the Cold Warriors of that era were imperialists. They supported American imperialism, they supported European imperialism, and they wanted European and American imperialism to win against Soviet imperialism, whereas Kennedy did not want either one. So he always spoke out against Soviet imperialism. Even in 1963, he was still speaking out against it. And he always spoke out against European colonialism, from when he was a congressman, a senator, a president. So I don't think his views changed that much. And he may have focused a little more on the Soviet imperialism while he was campaigning, because that's what was kind of being discussed at the time that he was campaigning. But he always was against it. He never, in 1963, he wasn't supporting Soviet imperialism. He wanted to make peace with the Soviets because he was anti-war. And it was a difficult, intricate balance because he was very, very opposed to war and very, very opposed to imperialism. And it's very difficult to perhaps be opposed to both at the same time. You know what I mean? Because you can oppose Soviet imperialism and European imperialism, but that doesn't mean you want to go necessarily to war with these entities to prevent it. And so he wanted to give a lot of aid to like Latin America and Africa and Asia because he felt the more independent these countries become, the harder it is to impose any sort of imperialism on these countries. So the harder it would be for the Soviets, the harder it would be for the Europeans. And that's what he really focused on, is making all the different regions in the world as independent as they possibly can be. And that would be the best way to fight imperialism and the best way to prevent wars. But he didn't want to use war as a mechanism to stop imperialism. Like, he wanted to avoid that if possible. Now, if push came to shove, he would, like he said in his inaugural, like, we're going to stand up for freedom. We're not going to let anyone, kind of take away our rights. So when comes to shove, he wasn't going to allow anyone to impose tyranny on America. But obviously he would try to find a peaceful resolution to any issue.
Do you do you have one of those anti-imperial speeches on the top of your head that isn't the Algeria one that I could possibly look up and play a little bit
Oh
of?
God, they're all written. They're not audio. If you look at the JFK library through like the 1950s, you can probably find some. I don't wouldn't know off the top of my head.
I wish he was born in like the 2000s and that this all would have happened because it would have been 1,000 times easier to have more pictures and recording stuff so I could be able to listen to
Yeah.
half of this stuff.
There were a few he gave to Irish audiences, I remember, where he talked about it, because the Irish are very anti-colonial, and he definitely talked to, there was a few like to Irish crowds that he talked about in that vein. But they're all written, they're not audio. Even the Algeria one doesn't have audio, it's just text. Um, but yeah, there were definitely a few that he gave in that vein. So I'm actually of the view that he didn't really change. He became better, because obviously with time people become more skilled, their skills. So I don't want to say that he didn't improve, because I do think he improved over time. He became a better leader. He became a more confident leader. Um, but I don't think his view changed. Like, he was never a warmonger. He was never an imperialist. Um, so in that sense, he did not change.
Do you think he always maintained the view of being more conservative?
Conservative in what way?
I think it's probably this next clip.
We knew a number of people in Washington. Perhaps among the most interesting were the Robert Kennedys.
Oh, really?
We saw a great deal of them socially, and of course I had a great deal to do with them in government.
Yeah.
But both
He was a very energetic and talented young man.
both Bobby and his wife Ethel were very energetic and very nice people.
Do you think Bobby would have made a good president?
I can't answer that. I can answer affirmatively and negatively.
Yeah.
It's very hard to judge. I do think he was a more conservative man than JFK. We knew
Okay,
a
maybe
number of,
he meant Bobby. I was always wondering because I heard him mention that. I never thought of like JFK as really as strong. Maybe in the beginning when he was young, could have had some conservative views, but I think that might have came from their dad. Um, he seemed a lot more progressive throughout his presidency, it
Yeah.
seems like.
He was conservative in the sense that he did obsess over budgets, over the balance of payments. So he was very financially conservative in a way. but that doesn't mean that he didn't support, programs for the needy, increasing Social Security, increasing Medicare, all these like Area Redevelopment Act, Manpower and Training Act, all these things he did, Public Works Act, because he realized that those weren't really the things that were costing the money. It was things like wars. I think he said we can't afford to go into Vietnam. It's going to destroy our balance of payments position. And so he was very financially conservative. He was very, very concerned about the financial stability of the United States and the financial position of the United States. So he wasn't, I guess, your traditional, or I guess the perception of a traditional Democrat or liberal, where it's like just spend all this money and, don't think about what you're spending. He was very cautious about spending, but he realized that it wasn't these programs that helped people that were creating the budget issues and the balance of payments issues and whatnot. It was things like wars and imperialism and things of that nature that were creating the problems. So he was financially conservative, but not in the traditional ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I got one more of John McCone to play for you, and then
Johnson was a legislator. He had had long experience in the Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. But when it came to being an executive as president, I don't think he performed very well.
I guess he was first and last a politician, wasn't he? That always came first.
Oh yes, he was that always.
Yeah.
Always.
First
In
and
many
last,
ways,
right.
in many ways, a very engaging man.
Now, another thing that
oh,
cracks down
that's just him ordering pants. I had to add that on to the ending of that because it's just too funny when he says bunghole on the thing. But this one was the clip I mentioned earlier about RFK and JFK having a conversation about John McCone. I didn't know this existed, and it was very hard to find.
Is this where he calls him a bastard? Is that
he
is
calls
that what
him?
this is?
I think so. Let's play it.
Okay, I think I know which one you're talking
Well,
about.
that was obviously based on what John told us. John McCone looked good. Yeah, but I didn't think he looked great. From that honeymoon.
That's what he said. I wrote that story in order to make sure that the record was clear of what they're doing.
What, that they're putting it out?
Yeah.
Yeah, but of course he put it that he was only sending it into the
CIA.
CIA. But he said CIA is pouring it out.
Yeah. And I think he specified that on behalf of John McCone.
And McCone was right.
Well, that John McCone, that they're trying to make themselves look good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what he said. This is where it's coming from, he said.
Yeah. He's a real bastard, that John McCone. However, they got him. Do you have any kind?
No, he was useful at a time.
Yeah, that's why it's really evaporated. But he's making stuff so, of course, everybody's on to him now. That's the trouble. He's stupid himself. Everybody's saying he's a horse's ass.
I just thought that was more interesting because after listening to, and I don't think John McCone was a LBJ guy either. I know he worked in the Eisenhower administration, he worked in JFK's administration, LBJ, but then he really talked about how he really liked Nixon. He used to have Nixon over his house for drinks and stuff like that. It seems like he was very close, but he did talk about he liked Robert Kennedy and his family. Thought he was very engaging and very kind of forward thinking when it came to certain things. And it was just interesting to me to kind of hear that because I was like, yeah, you don't hear a lot get talked about and stuff like that when it comes to just how RFK was. They'll say he's a bulldog or he's going after the mob, or they'll mention his relentlessness, but they never ever mention a close association with RFK, which I've tried to find recordings. Maybe they're out there somewhere. Which I always just thought it was interesting having these two brothers involved at the same time, during JFK's presidency, just involved in so much. And even back when they were in the Senate and stuff like that, I mean, they were just dealing with so much beforehand, having hearings and stuff and putting the mob out on trial and stuff.
Yeah, I think, and I might be getting this wrong, but I think Bobby's wife, Ethel, was close to John McCone's wife, maybe?
Her name's Thea. Her name's weird, but I think that's right.
Yeah, so I think that there was a familial closeness there. Because I think she was ill or something at some point, and I could be getting these people wrong. I'm not 100% sure, but I think she was close to McCone's wife or someone in McCone's family who was going through an illness or something.
His wife also worked in the administrations as well too, doing low stuff. She would be brought in on certain things like that. But John McCone was the director of the CIA, and he was one of the main people that lied with Richard Helms when they were testifying in court and stuff like that. So it's just so weird, like hearing them talk about this and like they remember history correctly, I guess. And then like really they lied in court and they should be probably thrown in jail. But I don't know. It was just interesting to get these people's perspective around them. That's why I was wondering if you knew any names offhand that were just people that were close as maybe not the same relationship that RFK had with his brother, obviously, but just were around. Like I said, Dean Rusk, I've heard that, but then I've heard things with LBJ where I was like, are we sure? It just seems like he's just doing his job at this point.
Yeah, Rusk and JFK were definitely not close. The people that were close to him or closest to him were people like Sorensen. Although I know Jackie had some doubts about Sorensen. And people like Kenny and Dave Powers, those were really the guys that were close to JFK. I don't think that the people that were in like official positions they were colleagues, they weren't necessarily like close friends.
What do you think about? I don't know if you've ever heard the LBJ and Jackie Kennedy phone calls before. And I wouldn't say there's flirting, but there's some weird kind of like it just doesn't. I don't know what's going on. Um, but what was the relationship there? Because obviously there's a lot of photos where Johnson's like really close to Jackie, like leaning over, like either he's drunk or something, and Jackie's kind of just like sitting there. And I'm not hinting at anything. I'm just trying to figure out what was going on with that. I mean, I thought it was very nice of him to call her. A lot of people call it like it was part of a conspiracy. I'm not getting into that. I've listened to the phone calls. They sound very cordial, but obviously there's the wink photograph where she's like, he's more obsessed about getting the position rather than caring the fact that her husband was just murdered. But then there's, I don't know if you ever came across this, but bill was passed by Johnson that was going to have Jackie make $50,000 the first year after Kennedy was assassinated, and then every year after that, like an extra $10,000 for reading mail because the mail had upticked after the assassination. I don't know if you've ever came across that. I have the phone calls on that. It wasn't LBJ's idea to do that. It changes into LBJ's idea when he starts calling people. I have this memo I would like to get passed for Jackie, but it was from Robert Kennedy. He said it. He said, I want this for the family, and I want this for like the whole family. I want Jackie to get this much money the first year, and then it's 10,000 just for mail reading or something that she was doing at the time. And Johnson helped push that through. So again, it makes it very complicated. I want to know what your kind of perspective is on the relationship between Jackie and LBJ.
Well, in her oral history, as I said before, Jackie felt that JFK always said, can you imagine if LBJ becomes president? So she kind of knew that Jack didn't have a very high view of him. And she also felt like LBJ was trying to take all the credit for everything that JFK did, and she didn't like that. So I don't think that her opinion of him was that high. I know some people say, I don't know how much credibility there is to this, that she suspected LBJ was involved in the assassination. I don't know if she did or didn't, but I don't think she had a very high opinion of him. And she definitely felt that Jack did not have a very high opinion of him.
There's I think it's who is it? Oh, I'm blanking on the name now. I was about to say I think it's Evelyn Lincoln that wrote in a book or a letter or something like that, and the secretary for JFK that stated that she thought it was LBJ, Hoover, the mob, basically named almost everybody but like the government that was involved in his assassination, which makes you wonder what that relationship was like. Like I've heard oral history interviews of people that worked in Nixon's administration. He used to walk around in his underwear, like with all the president's paintings down the line, and he would just be drunk, and he would just like be talking to the paintings, like they could hear him. And he was talking about how he's going to protect the country and do all these things. Where I go, it had to be crazy with LBJ. Like it just had to be something. I think there's a Secret Service guy that testified that the reason they had the buzzard by the desk in the White House was because LBJ was having an affair and Lady Bird had walked in, and he was mad at the Secret Service people for not alerting him. And that's not their job either. So it's like for them, it's just like to me, you hear these stories, and again, these are people that are giving interviews while they're being recorded or something. So you got to take it for what it is. But to me, I just wonder, I'm like, yeah, you listen to the phone conversations now. This is nothing you learn about in school when it comes to just the presidential reflection, I guess, that the public sees.
Yeah, I think what you learn in history books is very kind of watered down and very um, history in school is really boring, but I think history in reality is very interesting. Because, oh, go ahead.
Well, you read the oral histories for Jackie. Did she just talk about policies and things that she was involved in? Did she ever mention William Manchester's book?
No, I don't think she did from what I remember.
Because we still don't have the William Manchester tapes, all the recordings and stuff like that. And obviously, the Death of a President book that was done under the Kennedy family or for the Kennedy family under the orders of Jackie or whoever. But this became a really big problem. Like, there's so many phone calls with LBJ. There's phone calls with Katzenbach. There's phone calls with a lot of people that are mentioned in this book. Berkeley's in there, and they're all like denying anything that Manchester wrote in there. And it's weird for me. Like, I don't know. You obviously learning about this and getting involved in this, and either it's at the community or something of that about JFK. There's like a weird image that's not necessarily wrong, but it's not necessarily right of certain things that went on between LBJ, Kennedy, and all this type of stuff. And I wonder if it stems from that, what that book might have done, because it seems like LBJ talking about, I never told JFK he had to hang a deer head on his wall or something like that. Like, apparently he said that to William
That
Manchester or
was from
something.
Kenny's book.
So
No, that was Kenny O'Donnell's book.
that's
So
Kenny
they
O'Donnell's
went
book.
yeah, so they went on a so LBJ, this is when they were campaigning. LBJ wanted JFK to come down to his ranch and he wanted to take him hunting. And JFK's like, I already have enough stress. I don't need the guilt of shooting some poor animal on me. Like, but he couldn't get out of it. Like Kenny couldn't figure out how to get JFK out of it. So they went hunting and JFK did shoot a deer, which he was not happy about at all. And then LBJ came back to the Oval Office with this deer head. And JFK was like, my God, somebody get this thing out of here. I don't want this reminder that I shot this deer. And so JFK's like, I can't hurt LBJ's feelings. So what am I going to do with this thing? But he's like, it's not going to be in the Oval Office. There's no way in hell I'm going to allow this into the Oval Office. And so he found some obscure room in the White House to put it into to like keep LBJ happy. But
Is that
yeah,
real?
that's what that whole yeah, that's according to Kenny O'Donnell, that's what happened. That was in Kenny O'Donnell's book.
Because
Um
hold on, I gotta play. Yeah, I gotta play this. I called it these damn JFK books. Because literally, it's like, and I have to go back and edit it because I thought it was the William Manchester book, but now I think I do remember the Kenny O'Donnell story. But he's literally talking to Katzenbach on the phone, and he was even warned about like, and now I hear John Connolly's writing a book, and he's just like getting upset that all these books are coming out. I'm like, these people, like, I don't know. Like, again, I'm trying to find the reality in what some of this stuff was. And I think the way that LBJ was taking it was like they were making him seem like he was forcing JFK that he needed to have that deer thing on the wall. Because he starts mentioning a fish that JFK caught on his honeymoon that he had hung up.
We just got to save this damn country. This country, we haven't got any cinch on winning out there at all. It's just the opposite, I'm afraid. And I just think that we, I don't think Russ can do it, McNamara can do it, I can do it. I think maybe you're fresh enough and objective enough and judicious enough and honest enough and sincere enough, friend of all concerned. You don't have to be a traitor to anybody. You just have to be good and do what's right. But somebody's going to have to divide up the pie here and say, now, I never make a critical word of any Kennedy at any time. I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to say it. I'm dodging. I've taken these damn books and these things, and now John Connolly's writing one. What he's going to say, God knows. But I know one thing you can truthfully say. Kennedy insisted for 2 years that he come and make 5 money-raising speeches. And he finally told him in my presence, said, Mr. President, they're going to think all the Kennedys want out of Texas is money.
That was another issue with listening to the LBJ stuff, because apparently LBJ said that he never convinced Kennedy more than one time to come down to Texas to make a money-raising speech. Again, I remember what you told me about just offering the presidency, vice presidency to LBJ, but a lot of people suspect it was just to win Texas because they needed one of those, someone that had the pull that Johnson would have to boost his numbers up. Those are just two different theories or two different ideas, like based on information. But LBJ, he stated a lot of things that I was kind of looking at like, well, I think it's like well recorded that you did do pressure JFK on certain areas when it came to where he needs to go in certain places like that. And in that phone call, apparently what was written in a book, I don't know if it was Death of a President or a different one, was that he was telling JFK that he needs to go make 5 money raising speeches in Texas to get their thing. And then LBJ obviously covers himself at the end and says he only did one. And people are going to start thinking that all Kennedy wanted was money out of Texas. And I'm like, again, this is stuff that's background stuff that's going on. So I don't know. And also we examine a lot of headlines and articles and newspapers and things that get written about certain people, either in a flattering light or non-flattering light. And then listening to all these phone calls like Henry Luce and all these people like Life Magazine and all this stuff talking with LBJ, he's like, hey, can you take this little thing out of it? And they're like, yeah, I can do that for you, sir. Do you mind if I come by the White House? And he goes, yeah, we could talk it up on the whatever. And it's just so like, I don't know at this point, like the research and all the theories and rumors, and you hear this weird story about whatever. I don't know what's true on that. So like going back through it, I find it interesting. I don't know if you've come across, obviously, I mean, have you come across anything that maybe you've heard, but then you've looked into it and it might have been less than maybe it was hyped up to be just by word of mouth through researchers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's common that people exaggerate things and take things out of context. And I don't have a specific example, but I think that happens constantly, not just on Kennedy, but on any topic under the sun. I think that happens a lot. Um, in terms of LBJ being from Texas, I do think that played a role in the vice presidency. I think definitely JFK did not want him as VP, but I think also in the back of his mind, he politically understood that it had certain advantages. So he wasn't like 100% against it either. If he had been 100% against it, he wouldn't have even semi-offered it to him. So I think that did play a role. Like I think politically, he was a smart move as VP in terms of getting JFK elected, because I don't think the other choices that he had were that great either. Um, he wasn't his first choice, but he obviously accepted him as VP ultimately. So I think there's some truth to that.
Do you think JFK was ever given the fair chance by the press or anybody else with some serious, not motivations, but power in the field? Obviously, he wasn't taken serious by Eisenhower at first, but I guess they might have developed some type of peace or understanding between each other and a more mutual respect. I think it was a lot of this stuff came after JFK was assassinated. Truman started making statements towards JFK that were very favorable and very, very more critical of the CIA on certain things. And again, this is all after the fact. It wasn't during the time.
Yeah, I don't think the establishment was ever fond of him. I know in the summer of 1960, when he was campaigning, Truman spoke out against JFK, saying he was too young to run for president. He wasn't experienced enough to run for president. And Truman was a former president for the Democratic Party, so that carried a lot of weight. I don't think Eleanor Roosevelt was very fond of, JFK initially. I think she kind of was with Truman on that. Um, so the establishment definitely didn't like him, and he wasn't the establishment candidate for the Democratic nomination. Like he won all the primaries, and he still had trouble getting the nomination because that's how little the establishment wanted him as their candidate. So he for about 2 years before the nomination, he traveled to all these small towns all across America. It was really him and Ted Sorensen. Ted Sorensen told these stories where they'd be like on an airplane and it like flipped upside down. And when they landed, like without even an airstrip and like all these horror stories, he's like, I thought we were going to die. We both thought we were going to die. And like, but so they went into all the craziest places all over the country for like 2 years straight every weekend to campaign. And that's why he won all the primaries is he had, campaigned the old fashioned way and gotten a lot of support. And I don't think the Democratic Party expected him to have that much support. I don't think they expected him to win all the primaries. And so they were sort of forced to give him the nomination, but I don't think they ever wanted to. I think they would have preferred to give it to someone like Johnson, who was much more of an establishment candidate. So I don't think the establishment was ever fond of JFK. And in terms of the press, I know he made some comment where um, he said something like, everything the press writes about my administration is wrong. And if they get it wrong today, can you imagine how wrong the historians are going to get it if they can't even get it right in real time? Because the historians are going to read these papers, and these papers are nothing but BS. So he didn't have a particularly high view of the press or the way they were reporting on his administration. And that might have played a role into why he decided to record like meetings and phone calls and stuff. I think part of it was probably he wanted to record that stuff for his own memoirs that he hoped to write one day. Probably for the historical record, because he was huge on maintaining, a proper historical record. He was very, very big on that, and also just honesty. Like he didn't trust that the press was going to report accurately on his presidency. And I think rightfully so, he didn't trust them.
I don't know if you ever heard an interview with Bill Murray, but he knew a guy. I think, blanking on his last name right now. Bonaducci is the one that passed away for like a drug overdose or something like that. One of the famous ones. But he was like, I knew this guy personally. He was my best friend, and the person that wrote the biography was the same guy who did the Watergate thing. I'm blanking on his name now too. Do you know who I'm talking about? The one who broke the scandal on the
No,
Watergate scandal. Hold on, I can look it up.
I don't know his name.
Oh, it's
I'm
gonna.
sure I've heard that, but not
I
off the
think.
top of my
Yeah,
head.
I know he's famous. Bob Woodward. Bob
Okay,
Woodward had wrote
yeah.
the book on basically Bill Murray's like best friend, and he literally read it for like 5 pages, and then he puts the book down. He goes, "They framed Nixon." Like that was his remark after reading his book about one of his friends, and he said it basically had this new reporter literally report on one of the biggest stories ever, which was the Watergate one, and he just kind of like really hit to the point where you're understanding it, like, oh yeah, I bet the reporting back then was largely probably a lot of it was very, very wrong or very, very biased towards a point of view. I mean, we know about when Johnson became president, a lot of the scandals dropped on him. To me, it was just interesting because it seems like a lot of articles with Kennedy are not necessarily, there are some favorable ones, but there's not a lot. A lot of them are just really kind of critical. And it seems like he's in over his head is kind of like the headlines. And it's just like, I don't know, maybe because Kennedy was just a lot younger. But I think, you hear conversations with Eisenhower, he's calling them certain names that just mean that he's young and he's just too young to know what he's doing in office and stuff like that, which makes it a little bit more interesting when you look at what he will be remembered for. And it seems like we're still talking about him today. I think the Vietnam War in history classes just gets not enough respect it deserves. Mostly when it comes to talking about the Kennedy administration and things that were going on that were another alternative um, if the assassination wouldn't have happened. I want to ask you, what is your favorite speech by Kennedy?
Oh God, there's so many of them. I don't know. It's so hard to say. One of the two of my favorites, and maybe because they're towards the end, so they remind me of like what's we're about to lose, is his Family of Man speech in New York City, which I think he gave in October of 63. And then there was one he gave about Robert Frost at Amherst College, which was about the artist and how the greatest duty of the artist is to remain authentic. That was also, I think, October 63. They're not very well known speeches, either of them, but they're definitely two of my favorites. And I think partly because of the content of the speeches and partly because it's a reminder of how many great speeches we didn't get because he was assassinated shortly after. And actually, that Family of Man, I think, was early November. I don't think it was October. I think the Amherst one was October. I think the Family of Man was early November when he was in New York City.
Yeah, Amherst was in October 26, 1963. And then yeah, I just got that one up here. There's another one, January 20th, where apparently Robert Frost reads a poem at John F. Kennedy's
Yeah,
inauguration. That's pretty cool.
yeah. He spoke about Frost in a couple speeches throughout his presidency, but I do remember that one from October 63. So, but there's just so many good speeches. There's the famous ones like the civil rights speech and um, the peace speech. He gave a really nice speech at Berkeley, I think in the spring of 62, which also kind of talked about ending the Cold War and, traveling to space with the Soviets and things like that, and kind of leaving the Cold War like many, many miles behind. And so that was a really nice speech, the one at Berkeley, and I think it was March or April 62, something like that.
Now, with
Um,
those letters that he wrote with Khrushchev, where you get to experience kind of like a more peace and understanding and kind of like a mutual agreement of just not causing damage or destroying the world, basically. Um, what are your thoughts on that? But then also the thoughts that LBJ had many conversations, one with Dean Russell. I didn't know he called Richard Russell so much. Like I thought it was like one time at like the 29th about the commission, like you're going to serve as the famous one. But it's like that whole week, he was calling him like 3 times a day and they were having conversations. Then I think it's December 7th. I have a phone call recording where Richard Russell's, he's like, "How you doing, Rich?" And he's like, "Not too good." And he's like, "Well, it's a beautiful day out. You should get out there and enjoy it." And he goes, "You've ruined me." And he's like, "By putting me on this commission." And it was just so funny to hear that. He's like, I know, I've ruined you. And he's like, kind of like, "Yeah, but you're still serving, you know." But I was kind of always a little bit wondering, I guess, about the whole, I don't know, Khrushchev. I mean, he openly said that on the phone. I think it was with Richard Russell on the 29th, when the commission was established, that he didn't want to serve on it, but he thinks it was maybe Khrushchev had some part of it, but then they started going towards Castro. I mean, what are your thoughts on that based on what you know about the whole meeting with Castro and working out an understanding with Castro and then kind of the understanding with Khrushchev as well, too?
Yeah, so I think he definitely wanted or tried very hard to create détente with Khrushchev. He was never naive about it. You know, Jackie even said, late in 63, shortly before his death, before JFK's death, JFK said, everybody thinks Khrushchev's this great jolly guy now. He's like, I don't trust him one bit. I'm very aware of what he's done in the past. Like, so I don't think it was all like, all happy and like, he was definitely pursuing détente, but he was very aware that the Soviets could screw him again, like they did by placing the missiles into Cuba, by pushing on Berlin or whatnot. So he he said he was an idealist without illusions. So he had no illusions about the Soviets, but he also felt like if he were to push policies that benefited both sides, then they could create a real détente and a real peace. And they could sign things like the nuclear test ban treaty because it was beneficial to both sides. So he definitely wanted détente with the Soviet Union, but not in a naive way. I think a lot of people perceive it as naivete. He definitely was not naive about Khrushchev or about the Soviets. And in terms of Castro, as long as Castro, was not a satellite for the Soviet Union, he was open, and as long as he wasn't trying to spread communism to the other islands, he was open to having diplomatic relations with Castro. It was really, and I think he said even when I don't know what speech it was, I don't know, it was like December 62. I don't know if he's the one he gave to the Cuban exiles. I can't remember, but he said, as long as Castro is not a satellite to the Soviets, everything is possible. As long as he stays a satellite to the Soviets, nothing is possible. And so I think that was really the main issue is he didn't want Cuba to be a base for the Soviets. And as long as there was that separation, he was fine with normalizing relations with Castro.
I'm going to ask you kind of one final question here, but just based on what John McCone said about the moon project being what JFK is remembered for, or what do you think of with JFK? How do you think JFK should be remembered? Obviously, everything gets pulled into the assassination because there's just a tragic moment in American history, the world history, to be honest with you. In certain situations, it might happen more frequently in other countries, but when it comes to just the impact that JFK had, I mean, how do you remember JFK and how do you think he should be remembered?
I think he should be remembered as someone who wanted to make the world a better place, who was 100% committed to his job, which was to serve the American public, and in a way, the wider global public as well. He wanted to see a reduction in poverty. He wanted to see a reduction in hunger. He wanted to see people have opportunity. He didn't want to see war. He wanted to see, nuclear disarmament. He wanted to see like a peaceful, cooperative world. He wanted to see different countries working together instead of against each other and competing in a friendly way, competing in ideas rather than competing in arms. So I think he had a very hopeful vision of the world and he wanted to implement that vision. And I think people also need to realize all the atrocities that happened as a result of his assassination. I think it can be argued that Vietnam wouldn't have happened. I think it can be argued that the slaughter in Indonesia wouldn't have happened. I think it can be argued that later genocide in the Congo wouldn't have happened. I think it can be argued that what's happening in Gaza today would not be happening if JFK had lived. And so I think people need to think about the long-term ramifications and repercussions of his assassination and think about how different the world would be if we pursued, policies of nuclear disarmament, policies of détente, policies of trying to uplift people out of poverty. And if we had leaders who were thoughtful, who were considerate, who were actually working for the American public rather than working for special interests, I mean, you'd be living in a completely different world. And I think he should be remembered as someone who was genuinely doing his job and genuinely trying to make the world a better place.
Monica, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Yeah, they can find my books on Amazon and any of the other outlets. And I also recently set up a Twitter account where I post little clips of JFK speaking and little quotes from his speeches and stuff.
I'll make sure I link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you again, and thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.